Hey, how's it going, everybody? My name is Ben Smith. I handle all of the editing, mixing, and mastering for the Offbeat Life podcast. And so today we're going to start a video series on how to get your podcast started, right? Some basic equipment that you're going to need, some basic signal routing, gain staging. Eventually, we're going to dive into the software side of it to show you some basic editing techniques, mixing techniques, and then eventually we'll get to the export process of getting your file, having it fully prepped and ready to be pushed out on your podcasting platform of choice, right? So in this video in particular, we're going to focus on the equipment needed and the basic gain staging and techniques required to get that professional sounding podcast. I know some of this stuff can be pretty intimidating, especially if you're not familiar with audio equipment or routing, anything like that. It can be a little intimidating to get started, but the goal of this video is to just give you an overview, an equipment list, some do's and don'ts, maybe some different avenues to head down with equipment, just depending on, what your podcast is going to be made for. And so one of the really cool things in the day and age that we're living in is that you can do all of these things with a pretty minimal budget. Honestly, a few $100s, you can get your podcast off the ground and into people's ears sounding incredible, right? You don't need to have a studio booked out. You can do it in a bedroom. You can do it in an office. If you're doing a travel-based podcast shoot, you could even do it on a beach, right? But it's really important to be intentional with these techniques that we're going to talk about in these videos. It's really important to be intentional with the sound that you're going for. So you might want that super tight, close sound of a studio recording, or you might want a kind of distant room sound that is going to be more conversational. It just is important to know what sound you're going for, and it's important to be extremely intentional about that, right? Because once you figure out what sound you're going for, then you can mold your editing, you can mold your mixing, you can do all of these different things to not only have a unique sounding podcast, but one that still sounds professional and doesn't sound like you're trying to hack your way through it or anything like that, right? So that's kind of the point of these videos, is to show you some step-by-step things that you can do to get you that sound that you're after. Okay, so step one with getting your podcast off the ground is going to be the equipment that you're going to need, right? Pretty basic stuff, really. You can go as simple as one microphone, one cable, and a recorder, right? It doesn't have to be this elaborate setup. It doesn't have to be thousands and thousands of dollars, right? So let's just go through some of the basics that you're gonna need. So first and foremost is gonna be your microphone, right? That's what you're gonna speak into. That's what's gonna transmit your audio from acoustic sound waves to an electrical signal, and then eventually to a digital signal. And this is a really important piece because this is where it all starts, right? So you need to make sure that you get a quality microphone that is going to be able to handle everything that you need your podcast to do. And a beautiful thing is that there are a ton of options today with microphones, right? So this one that I have, this is a Telefunken M80, and it's a little bit of a higher end one, but it sounds amazing. And so you don't have to go necessarily with a higher end one. Another really popular one that a lot of podcasters use is the Shure SM7. And this is also a fantastic sounding microphone. But again, you don't have to necessarily go with a higher end microphone just getting started, right? You can go with something as simple as like a Shure SM58, right? That's a really classic microphone. Sounds great. You can find them used for really cheap. New, they're only $100. And so it's a great way to get you comfortable with the microphone, right? And they're total workhorses. I mean, you could use that microphone as a hammer if you needed to, right? They don't break. And so if you're really hard on equipment or gear, I would definitely suggest getting something like a Shure SM58. So there are other options as well. You don't have to go with your standard handheld microphone, right? There are other options like USB microphones. Rode makes some really good USB mics. Audio-Technica makes some really good USB mics. And so what these are gonna do is you can just plug the USB cable directly into your computer And that's going to allow you to bypass either your interface or your recorder, which we'll talk about later. So it's really just about what you want to do. Make sure to always look at reviews on them. And if you can, if you have the time, listen to examples of people using them properly, because there are some not so great USB mics out there that you might just end up wasting your money on, right? So that's kind of a basic overview of your microphones. Okay, so the next thing that you're gonna need is some headphones. These are mine that I use. They're Beyerdynamics, I don't know if you can see it from there, Beyerdynamic DT770 Pros. These are really, really great, comfortable headphones. That's another important thing. If you're gonna be doing your long form podcasting, right? Couple hours, you want to make sure that you get extremely comfortable headphones that you can wear for an extended amount of time. And definitely don't skimp on your headphones either, because this is going to be not only how you listen back to your podcast, this is going to be how you monitor it in the editing and mixing stages, right? So you want to make sure that you have good sounding headphones that you can wear for an extended amount of time. And I have some speakers behind me that I use for my mixing and editing, but those aren't totally necessary if you're just getting started. Totally fine to just be using some headphones, right? And sort of some great options for those are Audio-Technica. They're pretty affordable. They're also really comfortable and they sound really great too. I would just recommend also getting some over-ear ones, just because that's going to give you a full frequency range that you might not get if you're using earbuds. The next piece of equipment that I want to go over is going to be your recorder or interface. So this is going to be how you're going to get the audio from your microphone to your computer. So let's start with an interface. I use a Universal Audio Apollo Twin. Again, a little bit higher end, which isn't totally necessary. Granted, it's a fantastic sounding interface. There's a lot of flexibility with it, but you can move down the tiers there. Universal Audio makes a really great USB 3 interface called the Aero. Another fantastic sounding one that gives you some flexibility that you might need. You can also go with anything made by Focusrite. Their Scarlett series is, it's really great sounding. I've used those quite a bit and they sound great. They're versatile and they're pretty simple to use. There's also companies like Native Instruments. Their Complete Audio series is really great. They've got a couple different tiers that you can go up to expand as your podcast might grow. And I think that's another thing that's really important to keep in mind is don't corner yourself with the equipment that you buy, right? Buy it with the intent of expanding. That is, if you're doing interview styles, right? If you're just doing a solo podcast, then maybe just a 2-channel interface works great. But I would recommend, if you're planning on doing interviews, don't paint yourself into a corner with getting, a 2-channel interface, because maybe you might have a couple guests coming on at one time. And so you're going to need multiple channels to accommodate those microphones that are going to be involved in a bigger style interview, right? So just kind of the basics of what an interface does. You're going to plug in your microphone directly into the interface, and then from your interface, it's going to plug into your computer. From there, you can do all of the routing necessary in whatever digital audio workstation you're using, whether that's GarageBand, Audacity, Logic Pro, Ableton, Pro Tools, whatever one you're using. It's going to allow you to route those microphones to where they need to be routed so that you can record them onto your computer's hard drive. And we can go into a little bit more depth later on once we get into the software side of things, as far as, how to route it, different tips on sample rate, bit depth, all of that stuff. But anyways, right now, just focusing on the hardware side of it, right? So that's kind of what an interface does. It's also going to have headphone inputs to where you can monitor your podcast. And while you're recording, it's also going to do all of your playback while you're editing and mixing. And next, we can talk about recorders. This is going to be an independent piece of equipment from your computer, right? So an interface is going to be fully integrated with your computer, with your digital audio workstation. A recorder can be something as simple as just plugging a mic into it, putting in a high-speed SD card, and hitting record. This is going to be a really, really simple setup. Generally speaking, it's going to be pretty simple, but it does add an extra step into the process as opposed to an interface. So with an interface, like we talked about, it's fully integrated into your computer. The sound is coming from your mouth to the mic, from the mic into the interface, from the interface to your computer's hard drive. It's all set up in one. The only thing different with the recorder is that the audio is being transmitted to an SD card that then you have to take out, put into your computer, start that transfer process, which can take a little bit of time depending on how long your podcast is. So whatever you're comfortable with, if you're doing field recording, like we talked about earlier, if you're doing a travel podcast and you want to like do an episode on the beach or like in the woods or something, a recorder is a really great way to do it because the initial recording doesn't require a computer or laptop. You can do it anywhere. The recorders anymore are really, really small. You can put them in your pocket even. So this is going to allow you some location independence that you don't necessarily get with a interface. You can still, use an interface on a laptop or anything like that, but it's just going to be more cumbersome to carry all that stuff around and to lug it around with you. So a recorder is a really great option if you're going to be doing a lot of location-based stuff. If you're going to be traveling, to an office to interview somebody, for example, or if you're, going to be on the beach or you're going to be on top of a mountain, whatever you're doing, if you need some flexibility with your location, I would definitely recommend getting a recorder. And some really great options for recorders, they're going to be made by companies like Zoom, Olympus, Tascam. I personally have the Zoom H4n Pro. I've used that just for some field recording and gotten really, really great results from it. It's pretty affordable, it's compact, it's intuitive, all of these things that you want in something that you're going to take on the road with you potentially. There's also options like the Zoom H6. This is a little bit bigger. It's going to give you more inputs, more flexibility. So a lot of these smaller handheld recorders made by the companies like Zoom, Olympus, and Tascam, they're all going to offer more or less the same functionality, right? And they all sound good. It's just more about like preference. If you've used some and you figure out a workflow that you like with that manufacturer, you can make those buying decisions based on that. But they all sound great. They're all pretty intuitive. They're all pretty simple to use and they're compact. And so just one more piece of equipment that I wanted to go over very quickly is made by Rode. It's called the Rodecaster. And this is a really cool piece of equipment because it's like a hybrid between a recorder and an interface. It still has the SD capability that a recorder has to where you can take it anywhere, set it up, plug in an SD card and you're good to go. But it also gives you that flexibility of an interface where you can bypass the SD card and record straight into your computer or laptop. And this is a larger format recorder. It has multiple inputs, tons of flexibility with those inputs. It's got faders. It's got 1/8" phone inputs if you're doing phone interviews. Yeah, it's just a really cool piece of equipment. If that's something that you feel like you could grow into, would highly, highly recommend just making that investment initially because it's so flexible. You can pretty much get it to do whatever you need it to do. And it's just really, really cool. All right, so next we'll kind of breeze through these because there's not a ton of detail on these, but they're still incredibly important to your final product that you're going to be putting out, right? So the next thing you want to look at as far as equipment is going to be a mic stand, right? This is going to be this right here. It's going to hold the microphone. So if you're like me and you talk with your hands a lot, it frees you up to be animated while you're speaking. And another super important aspect of a mic stand is that it's going to keep the microphone stable and in one position to where you don't have to worry about, using your hand and moving it around, and maybe you forget to bring it up to your mouth. And so then for, 20 seconds of an interview, you sound really distant and then it gets back to being really close. I mean, it takes some of the guesswork out of manually handling your microphone. So I always recommend getting telescoping boom stands. And so this is going to give you some flexibility onto where you can place it. If you're doing a video like this, you can place the mic stand a little bit out of the shot. That way it's not, intruding on the angle that you have. And it gives you some options for where you want to place it. If you need to place it underneath pointing up, if you want to have it straight at you, it just gives you a little bit extra flexibility that just a regular tabletop stand can't necessarily give you. So another piece of equipment that often gets overlooked, but I think is so important, and I preach this to everybody, is going to be a pop filter like this. It's just a little cheap detail that you can add to save yourself some headache later on in the editing and mixing process, right? So this is just a small piece of fabric that's going to go in front of your microphone. It's just going to act as a barrier. What this is going to do is prevent what are called plosives. That's going to be like your B's and your P sounds that on a sensitive microphone can make a really loud, intrusive, just kind of nasty sound. And so this is going to help mitigate that. And it's also going to give you a way to stay consistent with how far or how close you get to your microphone. So really just kind of helps you practice good mic technique. And if you don't want to invest in a pop filter like this, there are some other really good options. You can just buy windscreens. Typically, these are used for like whenever you're recording outdoors, but it's going to act the same way as a pop filter is going to, right? So it's going to mitigate those plosives. And another good aspect that this does is it helps your sibilance. So if you're like me and you have really sharp, intense S's and T's, just very sharp consonant sounds, this acts as a barrier to cut up that sound before it gets to your mic, right? And so it's just a little thing that is going to end up saving you from some headache later on in your editing and mixing process. And so I guess the last one is kind of obvious, but it's really important still, is going to be your microphone cable. And it's really important to get high quality microphone cables because this is going to help mitigate any electrical noise that might be introduced in the recording process. And also with higher quality microphone cables, if you travel a lot, you don't have to worry about, breaking a connection on them. You can be tough on them. You can step on them, throw them around, any of this stuff. And you don't have to worry about ruining the cable itself. And so it's another really small detail that if you do correctly, it can save you time, it can save you money, and it can give you overall a better product in the long run. All right, so that's kind of the basics of the equipment that you're going to need to just get you started, right? It's going to be everything that you need to start your great sounding podcast. And so the next step is going to be what to do with this equipment, how to hook it up, how to get it integrated into your computer, how to make it sound good as it's being recorded. Because it's easy enough to think to just plug in a microphone, hit record, and then think that you're done. But unfortunately, it's not quite that simple, but it's also not difficult to do properly. And so the next thing we're going to talk about is going to be gain staging. And so this is going to be how much gain you add to your microphone or whatever input that you have into your recorder or your interface. This is really important because this can potentially ruin a recording if you don't do it correctly. And it can bring in a lot of noise if you don't do it correctly. It can just make your recording sound flat and thin. There's tons of things that can go wrong with this. And so it's really important to have a nice basic understanding of how to do this correctly to set you up for success in the next stage of your production, which is going to be the editing and mixing. So with gain staging, you want to make sure of a couple things. You want to make sure that your gain isn't too quiet, because if it's too quiet, you're just going to have to end up turning up the volume in your post-production phase of mixing and editing. That's going to bring in any noise in the room, and that's going to bring in electrical noise that is just always there. You can't really get around that. And so it's important to have your noise floor low enough compared to your actual signal to where it's masked and you're not running into that problem of constant noise, because that can be really distracting. If you're listening, I'm sure we've all heard that, where there's a really noisy recording and it's, at least for me, it's super distracting. And so we don't want that obviously for your podcast. And so there's also the other side of the coin of having too much gain, right? And so that's going to give you things like distortion. And I'll add an example where I'm purposely distorting just so you can hear what it sounds like. I'll actually do one of both, where the gain is too quiet, and then one where it's too loud, just so you kind of have an understanding of what it is. And so the idea is to hit the middle ground in between those two things, where you've got enough volume to where you're getting above that noise floor and not so much to where you're clipping and distorting. So one of the ways to figure out where that middle ground is at is to just monitor as you're testing out your setup. Once you get everything bought, you get it hooked up, just figure out your normal talking voice whenever you're having a conversation with somebody. So maybe put the mic a little bit away from you, maybe laugh. It feels pretty weird whenever you're doing it, but just do it by yourself. That way you don't have to feel uncomfortable with it. But maybe back away from the mic, laugh, make sure it's not clipping. Maybe get really, really close and see if you can make it clip that way, or if you're getting too much noise from it. And just kind of play around with your highs and lows in gain that's going to happen throughout a regular conversation. Because hopefully if you're doing a podcast, you've got some dynamics to your voice to where it's not just a total monotone, boring, kind of dull sound to it. You want to have inflection, you want to have some emotion as you're speaking. And so just kind of finding that middle ground of where are your lowest points while you're talking, and then also where are your highest points where you're talking as far as volume are concerned. And that way you can figure out your gain. And once you get to that point, generally you can leave it there at that setting, and you may have to divert here and there. Maybe as you get more comfortable, you start talking a little bit louder, and so you have to turn down your gain a bit. Or maybe you're in a really quiet environment, and so maybe you need to bring your gain up a little bit. Whatever the situation might be. If you're outdoors, maybe you have to bring your gain down. Whatever it is, just play with it. Always do testing beforehand. It's so important, especially if you're in a inconsistent environment, to just test beforehand. Make sure you've got all your ducks in a row, because there's, in my opinion, few things worse than getting a podcast finished just to listen back and hear a bunch of audio issues with it. And so, just keep that in mind. I'll show you guys some examples of, how you can watch a meter to dictate whether or not you need to add or take away some gain. So I will leave it there and show you guys some examples. All right. So I just wanted to give you a quick example of what I was talking about with proper gain staging. So right now, this is a pretty good spot to be sitting in with your gain. Well, in my case, going into my interface. But these same principles are going to apply to whatever interface you're using or recorder. And so what you're seeing here is just the monitoring software that comes standard with universal audio interfaces. The metering is going to more or less be the same whether you're using your Focusrite monitoring software or your digital audio workstation metering software. It's all going to look the same, and the principles are going to hold true throughout any of those, right? So anyways, this is about where you need to be at if you're recording. So as you can tell by the meters right here, there is still plenty of room for me to get really, really loud and dig into it without reaching that top 0 mark. Because once you hit that, you're going to start clipping. It's going to distort. It's going to sound crunchy, and it's just not a good sound at all. And if you get too low down here towards the bottom, in post-production, you're inevitably going to have to raise the volume of it, which is going to bring that noise with it. So this is a comfortable spot to be in that's going to give you headroom to where you don't really have to worry about any sort of clipping or distortion, but it's also going to keep you far enough above the noise floor. And so I just wanted to give some examples just so you can hear it and see firsthand what the metering is going to look like as you adjust the gain. And so I'm going to bring down the preamp gain so that you can see and hear what I'm talking about with the noise floor. I'm going to continue speaking at the same level, but just bring the preamp gain down. And then in post, I'll raise the level to match where it's currently at right now. And you'll hear the noise come up with it, right? So right now, this is pretty low. Typically, it won't ever be this low, but this is just for the sake of you understanding what I'm talking about with the noise floor and your electrical noise and your room noise that's going to come along with it. So as you can hear, there's a decent amount of noise happening. That isn't a deal breaker. There are ways to kind of mitigate that noise in post-production with different plugins and software, but it's still not very good practice, and it's going to take up some time for you to work on that to get rid of the noise. And so just starting with a good gain structure is going to save you time and, probably frustration in the long run, right? So just take notice of the noise that's happening right now. And yeah, this is pretty extreme again, but just using it as an example. So going back to the gain about where we were at before, again, you're just hearing the difference right here, right? So the level that you are hearing is the same, but the amount of noise that is involved with what you're hearing right now as opposed to the lower gain one is pretty significant. And so next, I'll just give you an example of what a distorted signal sounds like. You'll also be able to see on the metering here what it looks like, just so you have visual context to it. So this right here is going to be way too much gain. As you can see, most of the time I'm just slamming this meter. It's hitting red. It's showing clip here. This is not at all where you want to be at ever in any situation. This is arguably worse than not enough gain, because this crunchiness, this noise that you're hearing, the distortion, this really can't be gotten rid of. This is recording straight to my computer, and it's very, very difficult to get rid of, or at least mask. You're not even getting rid of it. You're just kind of hiding it. And if it's bad enough, you can't even hide it. And so you just get this really annoying, crunchy, distorted sound, and it just is not good. This can ruin recordings. And so do your absolute best to avoid getting too much gain. So yeah, I hope that helped kind of visualize and give you an audio example of what I'm talking about with gain staging and just kind of the importance of it. Doing it right is going to save you time and trouble later on, in whether you're doing the editing yourself or if you're sending it to somebody like me to do the editing. It's just going to save everybody time, save them frustration, and you know that you'll be recording properly. So hope that helps. Hey, and thanks so much for checking out this first video. This is going to be the first one of a series where we go through the basics of starting, post-production, and then finishing an episode. And so really happy that you guys have been paying attention. Hopefully you've learned some stuff and hopefully gained some insight into what it takes to make a great sounding podcast. And I cannot wait to hear any questions that you guys have. And I can't wait to hear the final products that you guys come out with. So if you do have any questions or you want to dive a little bit deeper, I know a lot of this stuff is pretty surface level, but it's more done in the vein to just get you started, because I mean, there's an endless avenues that you can take once you get the basics figured out. So if you have any questions or anything, or you want to dive deeper into any of this, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me. DM me on Instagram, email me. I'll put both of those, my Instagram handle and my email address, on the screen. Reach out to me, talk to me, ask any questions. I love talking about this stuff. I mean, this is what I do professionally, and so this is what I'm passionate about. I love helping people gain an understanding of how to do this. And so yeah, don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have any questions, concerns, you want more gear recommendations, because again, this was all pretty surface level. If you've got questions about gear, equipment, any of that stuff, just please reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you.